Hello, and I'm going to introduce Carol Wild, who was working in North Oxfordshire on a programme to support transition for vulnerable students between primary and secondary schools. Carol.
I'm Carol, and I have a dual role. I work part-time at University of Warwick, where I am programme leader for a Masters in Education. My background is as a secondary art teacher years ago, but in the rest of my time, in the other part-time, I pursue my own participatory projects and research, and in that context I did some work with Cherwell District Council with an aim to work with schools in Banbury. There were a number of us in a project focusing on transition, and the work really led to a long-term relationship with Hillview School in Banbury, looking at transition for vulnerable children. But the reason for talking about my Warwick role, which I'll come back to at the end, is that the kind of approach that we took really came out of research that I had done, looking at transitions for international students, mainly Chinese students coming to the UK to take up university courses and the culture change there. So I'll connect the two at the end. So the aims of the project really were related to a question. The question being, might helping pupils tell the story of their own attachments to their primary school, provide a way to foster strategies and confidence for forming positive attachments at secondary school. The Hillview Primary School is a fantastic school, and it has a large number of children that join it midway through their primary years, where perhaps they have not had successful starts at other schools and they've had to move on, or where family circumstances have led to a number of different changes of location. And there was a sense in which some of those transitions had been quite traumatic previously, and how can we support children who've already been through perhaps unsuccessful transitions have a successful transition from primary to secondary school. So next slide, please. The school we had the aim of identifying a small group, 12, 15 children in year 6 who were identified as possibly being vulnerable to transition. And that was left to the teachers to define what vulnerable meant, and we wanted it to be as broad a definition as possible. The group of children had a real mix of children in it, but it's fair to say that there were a number of them that perhaps might be described as neurodivergent in some way. That was kind of key information that I needed to have before the project started. And we agreed that it was important that they had a member of staff with them at all times through the project who knew them well, because really we were working with therapeutic aims, and it needed to be a safe space for the children to be in. So began with a teacher that knew them well at the beginning, and then as the project progressed, that transferred to a teaching assistant, and then myself as the artist educator to facilitate it. So next slide, please. So what we were interested in looking at was trying to create a project that bridged primary and secondary, knowing, I think that was said in the first presentation, that transition is not something that happens quickly, that the issues of transition continue on beyond that initial moving from primary to secondary school. And we were also aware of a disconnect in our conversations between perhaps how primary schools approach transition and what their aims are, and how the secondary schools approach transition and what their aims are. And the research is a bit of research that I will share in the final slide, kind of backs that up, that primary schools tend to put more emphasis on feelings and belonging, whereas secondary schools are more concerned about behaviour and academic continuity, less concerned about questions of belonging and feeling. And we were looking at bridging that. So the first stage of the project was planned to happen just before the pupils attended their transition days at secondary school. I should say that this project happened in, where are we, 2018-19, was due to be repeated last year, was postponed, and we're going to be doing another version of it this year. So transition was able to happen in that kind of very physical way. The second stage took place at the secondary school just after the transition days. And then the third stage was planned to take place at the beginning of the autumn term at the secondary school. And actually, for many reasons, that was delayed, and it ended up happening more just after half term in October. Next slide, please. So what did it involve, what we're talking about? The aim was really to have lots and lots of talking, to try and get the group talking about their experiences at primary school, sharing their experiences, speculating about going to secondary school and what their hopes and their ambitions for that was. And we facilitated that through also lots and lots of walking together, taking tours of both schools, walking around, talking about those places and spaces, and really having physical connection with the places and the objects and materials of both their primary setting and the secondary setting, with the aim of creating a shared outcome together to enhance belonging, not just to the group, but to the schools that we were talking about. What we really wanted to encourage was a sense of feeling that they belonged at the secondary school that they were going to, that this was their place as much as their primary school was their place. So next slide, please. So stage one, what did it involve? So we began with the group in the primary school individually making a map of their primary school and the places in it that they felt were significant and important. We really bigged up the fact that I was a guest, that I didn't really know the school very well. Please tell me everything it's important to know about this place, but more importantly, what's significant to you about it. So we had a really small group that had been in the school all the way through from reception, and then others that had joined at different times. And that influenced the map that they made. They shared their maps in small groups. And then the idea was to plan a tour to take me around the school to show me everything that was important. And so they had to negotiate as a group what was going to be involved, what was the best order to see things in, and so on. And so off we went with the idea of recording that tour by mainly collecting objects. That the challenge was that we would come back to where we began, laden with things that we could use in the piece of artwork that we were going to make. So they had to be things that the teachers weren't going to get back again from their classrooms and so on. So for example, there was as there often is in the reception classrooms, a rug, a carpet where the children sat to have stories, and that had survived all of those years of primary school since the small group had just started. So pulling a few fibres from the rug and putting them in our bag, bringing them back to the space with us, and taking photographs, taking pictures of teachers and people along the way, and so on. And then constantly reviewing it and talking about it. And as is always the way, they then noticed things on the tour that they had forgotten about when they were drawing their maps. So having to kind of stop for longer. It took a very, very long time, this tour, and the school were brilliant. The teachers in different classes were brilliant in letting us interrupt and go around and do it. Next slide, please. So then we paused, and I can never remember what it stands for, and I did write it down on a bit of paper so I could tell you, but I've just lost the bit of paper. STARS. UCL did a project about transition that involved interviewing 2,000 primary school pupils in year 6, then at the beginning of year 7, and then at the end of year 7, about what things worried them, what they were concerned about at school. So we used that as the impetus, the inspiration, and spread around on the classroom floor, all of those things that came up in that study. And we asked the pupils to guess what they thought the year sixes in this study worried most about in year 6 and what they worried most about in year 7. We asked them if they felt there were any things that were missing. We then gradually talked about how that related to their own feelings. And then we talked about their memories of previous transitions and how those words may be compared to the things they worried about when they started primary school, when they perhaps moved from one primary school to another. And we predicted what they might be concerned about in a year's time, what they might no longer be concerned about, and so on. And they were incredibly, I was really surprised with the group actually. I thought they might be a bit reticent to do this, but lots and lots of discussion and very eager to share their feelings and their ideas. So next stage. Next slide, sorry. So here's, you won't be able to see this, this is tiny, but this is from the STARS report, and you can see, I mean, most of these are fairly obvious, you know, things like the biggest worry in year 6 is losing old friends, discipline and detentions, homework, being bullied, older children, and so on. And they change slightly over the course of year 6 and year 7, but not hugely. Next slide, please. So then what we used was the river concept. Now the idea of using a river to work through experiences is a fairly common one in both therapeutic practices, but also in sociological research as well, educational research. So, for example, that there's studies that have used the drawing of a river to map children's experiences of learning to read, and so on. It's a really productive concept, and we took that as a way of visualizing for the children their experiences of primary school and going into secondary school. We used a picture book to help them start to get some images or some ideas in their mind. I'll show you that in a minute. We had we looked at the book, we talked about the symbolism and the metaphors in that, what they thought about that. Then we had some time of ideas generation where they drew their own rivers to represent primary school going into transition, then working in small groups, and then we negotiated very much. We had a massive sheet of paper on the floor where we had lots of discussion about what shape the river should be, what things we could include, and so on. Wanted to get everyone's ideas on this river, agreeing the composition. And the idea was that what we were going to do, and the children kind of came up with this partly, was divide it in half and have half of the composition that we made at the primary school, and then the other half displayed at the secondary school to represent this kind of what felt at the time this sense of dividing themselves in half, quite literally. So next slide, please. So this amazing book by Mark Martin, I've seen used in quite a lot of different contexts. Is just a book of this girl in a boat traveling along a river. So we'll just go through the next few slides one after the other so you can see just some of the illustrations. So this is the cover. Next slide, please. And these are a couple of pages from the book. Thank you. Can we go back to that previous slide? I forgot, I deleted a few because I knew I wouldn't have enough time. If we go back to the previous slide. There we go. So you just get an idea of the illustrations there, that they convey different feelings, different experiences, emotions. Some are very peaceful, some are very lonely, some very scary. And there's a couple where the river branches off and there's choices to be made about which direction to be going in, and so on. So next slide, please. So then we got down to making. So this was going to be a mixed media painting collage. It was very much about getting the groups to get their hands dirty and incorporating some of those objects that they'd found into their ideas. As I said, you know, there were issues at times with the group negotiating, and but that they were brilliant. We had 4 groups that they all we kind of agreed would work well together. placing their objects, deciding where they should go, then creating their backgrounds, and then working on it with details. Now, I should say we did have some amazing photos, but in the final stage of the project, the camera that I took them all on was stolen by somebody, so we lost all of those amazing photos. I was being really good and not using my phone to take pictures and using a separate camera instead, and it was all lost. So the images that we do have were taken by a teacher on one of the school iPads instead, and they're not as good as the ones we initially took, unfortunately. So next slide, please. So this is just a section at the stage where we were placing everything on. Some of the objects were found as we were walking around the school. Others, the pupils brought in from home to represent themselves after the conversations that we had. And then others, they said, oh, well, wouldn't it be good if we had this? And so I was able to find them. So this is one girl who, she was out of everybody. She was adamant that school wasn't that important to her and that the transition wasn't going to be a big deal to her, because what was important to her was home and her family had been constant through lots of different changes. So she was one of the students who had transitions from other schools previously. And the shells were representative of her family, an extended family. And then she just stuck this huge bit of rope, I'm still no idea where it came from, right around it, this kind of very protective boundary all around it. And she spent the entire project only working on this piece and wasn't really that interested in working with other people, but we found a way of incorporating it into a section with other people. Next slide. So here's a kind of zooming out, so you can kind of see the river. This is it wasn't complete at this stage, but you can see the river kind of wiggling around, and there are times when it kind of is more wiggly and times when it's very smooth. You can see in the bottom left corner there this grey blob. One of the pupils was really into the idea of huge rocks being placed along the way on the river to represent challenges, and his challenges. He didn't want to tell anyone what the challenges were, but they were there to represent different times along the way of his schooling where he'd encountered obstacles. You'll see in another slide at the very end a massive one to represent secondary school, and he wrote the name of the secondary school on it to say, you know, this is a big challenge for me, I'm not looking forward to this. Next slide, please. And this tiny little group here is a couple of girls who were representing their friendship group there, who it was quite a challenge for them to do this. I can't do this, I don't know how to do this, you know, all these ideas. And we eventually came up with the idea of representing them through animals, and they chose an animal to represent each of them, their personality. They were incredibly concerned about being split up. When they went to secondary school, their stories were that it had taken them a long time to kind of bed into primary school, that friendships at the beginning had been difficult, that finally this group of friends had emerged and they were now very, very secure with each other, and they were worried about the move to secondary school and what that might mean for them. These are shrinky dinks in the end that we printed out the pictures and shrunk them and stuck them on. Next slide. And then this was called the Kraken. This is a giant monster appearing in the beginning of year 6. This is one of the most neurodivergent individuals involved in the project, representing year 6 for him, which wasn't just moving to secondary school, it was the experience of SATs and all of those other things going on there. And the next slide shows it a bit zoomed out, I think. So if we go to the next slide, you can kind of see it there at the bottom, this huge brown shape kind of rearing up, ready to eat them all. And you can see at the top there the huge grey rock of secondary school that they're all about to encounter as well. And at the top, you can't really see it very well. But what was interesting, some of the things that started to come out were not just about secondary school. There were huge concerns about the future, about the environment, about the money, other things, jobs that were way, way beyond the scope of what we were initially talking about. But they came in, and the black section at the top, that's kind of, I couldn't quite get it to clear enough. I did try. One of the girls, as we went around the school, collected lots and lots of little bits of plastic off the floor and stuck them all down. And this kind of represented climate crisis and so on. So it's really interested that the way they introduced these other things into it. But they were really proud of it at the end. I can't believe we did it. It's the best thing I've ever made. Those kind of things. Next slide, please. So having done that, they went on their induction days at secondary school, and then I met them following that a week later. We took the painting up to the secondary school to show to teachers there. And the idea was that we would kind of repeat the activity, that they would draw a map of the school and we would go for a walk, and they would tell me about what was significant, what was important, what they were looking forward to about secondary school, that they would show me things. It was brilliant because actually we got lost because they didn't really know the map of the school particularly well, so that meant that we ended up in sections that they hadn't previously been allowed to see, and so on, whilst we were finding our way. We went on this tour, lots of talking, and then in this final session we made a little box to include memories of primary school, but then hopes about secondary school. That was something that they could then take home with them, leaving the painting at the school. I haven't got any photos of those because, as I've said, the camera went missing during the day. So finally, then stage 6, extending the river, was going back in October, with the idea of them drawing what had happened since and how they were feeling now. What was interesting about it, although there was lots and lots to say, they had lots and lots to tell me, they really clearly no longer identified with each other as a group, and that was quite strong. In fact, some of them were very clear wanted to make this, I'm not part of these people anymore, I don't want to sit over here with them, and so on. And there were two groups. There was one group of students that very clearly were happy and had transitioned well, and another group where there were still issues. What came out of it very, very clearly was the significance of the library for all of them as a place where they felt safe. And then homework domineering everything was also something they all shared in common. Returning to my notes about it all, it was quite amazing the amount of stuff that they shared. Next slide, please. So just a comment, didn't want to give lots of information about the students because the therapeutic nature of it, but one comment from the school that Aidan demonstrated very challenging behaviour, changed his name by the way, during his time at primary school. He became increasingly nervous around the time of transition with erratic behaviour. He really enjoyed his time spent on the River project. The space and the project gave him time to express what he was really going to miss about primary school and connect it fully with his journey to secondary school. It also gave the children time needed to explore their feelings. The idea of a river was a great connection between the two. Aidan's transition was a positive experience, and this project really supported that. He's doing really well at secondary school. Next slide, please. So what now? So we had planned to repeat the river last year, but in the end, the primary and secondary school working together became too difficult around that. We're going to do it this year, but with a focus on the primary school. I think that was the unsuccessful part of the project, really, is that connection with the secondary school and agreeing the therapeutic aims of it. So our experiences bear out the research that the secondary school is more concerned with academic and behavioural continuity as much as belonging. What we're exploring with the primary school, not for this year, but following year perhaps, is how to extend it to a larger number of students, to still still have the therapeutic thread running through, but not quite intense, so that we can scale it up for the whole year group. But we do think a similar project that starts afresh with students in secondary school, working through some of these issues, is worth exploring still. I think just the numbers of people involved in order to connect up a primary to secondary project was difficult, and what our outcomes, our discovery was, in terms of by the time they got to kind of towards past half term at secondary school, they weren't really identifying with each other as a primary group anyway, and so a new project could work really well. Next slide. Were there no more slides? Oh, there are. Yes, there are. I was wondering that there were no more slides. So some of the research behind it really quickly. Is it possible to predict who is vulnerable to transition? Some studies say yes. So this is what it stands for, STARS, School Transition and Adjustment Research Study. They would say that yes, it is possible to predict students who are vulnerable to transition. And that this was the study particularly that found that disconnect between primary and secondary objectives in transition projects. But then other studies say no, that actually how we should be approaching it, that all pupils are vulnerable to transition. And that's the kind of starting point we should begin with, and work to include as many people as possible. Next slide, please. So my research, as I said at the beginning, looking at in international students transitioning to higher education in the UK, and that was where this idea of place attachment, or the importance of feeling attached to a place, really came to the fore. So, for example, just to choose one, a study of international students in higher education tracking students' experiences over time found that students that very quickly form a connection to a place, whether it's a coffee shop or a seat in the library or whatever, that's a really good indicator of their longer term resilience and academic success. So the more quickly that they can be encouraged to find a place somewhere where they feel like they might belong, the more successful they're likely to be. And then similarly, studies in the US have found that school attachment has an effective context. I feel like I belong here. I feel like there's a place for me is really, really important. And then another study here that found that self-esteem at school is connected to a secure place attachment. The students that can talk and express a kind of sense of this is my place, my school, their self-esteem is likely to be increased through that as well. So these are just some snippets of a wider body of research, but if you wanted to follow them up, there's the references there, so you can do so. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.